Hello, and welcome to another episode of Serenity Speaks, Conversations on Wellness. I'm your host, Cleo, and today we have a truly inspiring episode. My guest, Charlotte Budd, is a survivor of domestic abuse who has transformed her journey of healing into a mission to help others. Charlotte is also a trauma-informed Reiki practitioner, a children's mindfulness and meditation teacher, and a published author. We'll be discussing her personal story, the power of energy healing, and how mindfulness can support both adults and children in overcoming trauma. This conversation is one of resilience, hope, and empowerment. So get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. So hello Charlotte.
Hi.
How are you today?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, and I'm so pleased to have you as a guest on the podcast today. I've got so many questions, but we'll just start by you introducing yourself, telling us a bit about you, where you are in the present, and kind of how your journey has brought you to this place.
So my name is Charlotte Budd, and I'm a trauma-informed Reiki practitioner. I also host women's circles and teach mindfulness and meditation to children. And I'm an ambassador for EIDA, which stands for Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse. So that's about educating about domestic abuse, particularly in the workforce, and using my own lived experience to speak. I also speak at colleges and things like that to raise awareness. I'm a really passionate advocate about raising awareness around domestic abuse, and also that journey has kind of gone on to the healing path as well, because I really wanted to give something to victims directly to help them on that healing journey.
Yeah, that totally makes a lot of sense, because like you say, it's having the conversations, being able to speak, but then what direction do you go in then?
Yeah.
You know, how do you move forward, which is amazing. I haven't heard of this organisation. So it was called EIDA, EIDA.
Yeah, IDA, EIDA, and it stands for Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse. So they do a lot of work with, I mean, they're very successful now. They're a huge organisation, and they go into workplaces and make sure that they have the right policies in place as well, so that if they have an employee that comes to them and says, I'm a victim of domestic abuse, they have the right information, the right signposting. It's very much based on the ambassadors who have lived experience, really putting their stories in as well. So there's that lived experience and authentic voice for them to lead by.
That sounds fantastic. I'll pop a note in the show notes so that people can go and check that out as well. That sounds amazing. So can you share a bit about your journey and the challenges you faced? I suppose really how it started, like in the relationship that you were in. Were there any signs you felt or that you noticed, when you look back? I know from my experience, I can look back and think, gosh, maybe it didn't feel like a sign at the time, but looking back, it feels so, glaringly obvious. But yeah, if you mind, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, my journey began because of my own experiences with domestic abuse. And I was married and I have a child with him. And yeah, like you said, it's so difficult because when you look back, you think, of course, now, and now with the knowledge that I have and the training and everything that I do, of course, I can see those red flags. But that's the thing, and that's how domestic abuse works. Nobody just turns around and starts making violent threats or is physically abusive. It doesn't work that way. There is a slow drip feed into your psyche that erodes at you. There's a lot of gaslighting, a lot of coercive control that gets to that point. And I think that's something that's really important to always remember.
Yeah,
Because victims are so controlled and so downtrodden for such a long time before it gets really bad.
Mm.
And of course, when we look back, we can see those red flags, but at the time, we constantly question ourselves. And that
Yeah.
is because of the perpetrator constantly putting us down, constantly gaslighting. So it makes it very difficult to see red flags in the beginning. And throughout, well, certainly when I got pregnant, things got worse, which is quite common because, again, it's about that power and control. Eventually, I left because he did come home drunk and he was physically violent. And he was so volatile. And even in the months leading up to that time, there were a lot of threats, like violent threats all the time. And the police were involved, and I did leave.
Mm.
And my daughter was around 3 months old at that time. So it was incredibly difficult. It was a really difficult decision to leave at that point.
Mm.
But unfortunately, I then suffered a lot of post separation abuse. And I think that really added a whole nother layer. I didn't understand what post separation abuse was, I'd never heard of it. I thought that I was doing the right thing by leaving. I thought, no, I'm not going to press charges. I'm going to do the right thing. I'm just going to hopefully here get help and all of that. And I was kind of really naive, and it knocked it out of me completely, then thinking, no, I'm going to be really strong and independent and I'm going to do the right thing. And I managed to rent a property and rebuild my life. But then that post separation abuse continued, and it really shocked me.
Which is, I don't suppose so. When you say post separation, so that's after you've separated, and
Mm.
then he was still trying to control or doing things that were affecting
Yeah.
you quite deeply, mentally and emotionally. Yeah.
Yeah, so there was a number of things that happened, and it's very post separation abuse is incredibly common because when somebody who is that controlling, the perpetrator, loses their control over their victim, they'll do anything that they can to keep that control.
Yeah.
And that's why it's not easy for people to just walk away. It's often a time where things become more dangerous.
Yeah.
And there were eventually, I mean, there were all sorts of things that happened. There was a lot of economic and financial abuse, like no child maintenance, which left me and my daughter in poverty. It was incredibly difficult, really, really difficult time. There were things like hacking into my Amazon account. There were phone calls in the middle of the night, and it was obviously him. There was all sorts of things, but then eventually it did get worse, and he threatened to stab me. So it got really bad, and again at that point, I did go back to the police. Unfortunately, the police were not very good at the time. They really let me down. And I think at that point is when I started to suffer with really bad anxiety,
Yeah.
because of the ongoing of the whole thing, and then also being let down by the police. I turned to them, and that's really hard as well for victims to do, to go to the police and make those disclosures, and then you're really let down.
Mm.
That's really hard to go through because it then adds another layer of kind of injustice to the whole thing.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so I went through all of that, and that's when I really started to suffer, I think, with anxiety. And it was an incredibly hard time.
Yeah. Yeah. Because um, I think it's because as well. I mean, I don't know if you agree, but when you do pick up the courage to go to the police, and then you feel as if they're not really paying attention, like this is such. I know I have that experience, so it's almost like, oh, you're bothering us again, and I mean,
Mm,
I'm talking about 35 years ago, and it was this idea that, well, why have you got yourself into that situation, or what are you doing about it? So I
mm,
always used to feel like I was all, it's almost like tiptoeing, asking for help, and then having this idea that I remember saying these words. It's so ridiculous, but I don't want to press charges. I just want a note made. So if anything else happens, you know, what's going on, because I didn't want to be too much trouble, you know. And I think that's incredibly, again, looking back, I think, gosh, you know, that's how you're made to feel, like you're causing problems, you know. And actually, it's just the plea for help. And if police can't help, where do you go after that?
Yeah.
Where else? Yeah.
Yeah, and you do that. That's really true. That feeling of you don't want to seem like too much trouble. And in my
Mm,
case, his behaviour when we were together in the lead up of the first arrest, he was really volatile and he'd smash things up and he'd threaten to smash my face in. And he was really volatile. It was awful. He'd
mm,
barge past me. And if I ever sort of stood up to him and said, well, if this continues, I want to call the police, that would then get used against me. And he'd say, how dare you? How dare you threaten to call the police? This is my house. I pay the bills here. What are you going to do if I go to prison? You'll have nothing. And so by the time the police were called,
mm,
I was sat in front of them. I was like, oh, maybe I'll hold back. I don't want to press charges. That
mm,
drip into your psyche is already there. So I
yeah,
was so nervous about pressing charges and so nervous about making too much trouble because that constant threat of how dare you threaten to call the police on me? How dare you? How dare you stand up to me? Um, so the fear was already there, planted. So when the
yeah,
police were there, I was like, oh no, I don't want to be too much trouble. I just want it to end and I just want to leave the situation. I don't want to press
mm,
charges and I don't want to be in a problem. I don't want to kick up a fuss.
yeah.
And that's really there in your psyche before you even got to that point.
Yeah, totally, totally. And I mean, I'm really glad that I look at the way things are now, and there's still a lot of work to be done, but I'm glad there are changes, because back then, when you said that, well, you don't want to press charges, you're wasting our time. At least now there's some kind of understanding of why somebody would say that, because
Yeah.
then it's like, what are you calling us? You don't want to press charge. We don't understand what it is you want us to do. You either press charges or you don't. And
Yeah.
there was no kind of, there was no understanding really. Um, yeah, so now I'm glad there is this like education from people like yourselves who, you know, go into colleges and organisations, especially with the police. I feel like that's a whole different ball game for them now. There is that level of understanding. Um, and would you say that going having your experiences has driven you obviously on the path that you're on, but do you feel like that's now kind of become a strength that you have, like for others? For
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, definitely. I think there got to a point. I also went through the family courts for 2.5 years, and my experiences of the family courts were absolutely horrifying.
Oh,
We weren't protected. I had no legal representation, and he wasn't paying child maintenance. He had this legal team. I was just like this deer caught in headlights, completely taken advantage of. Didn't know what my legal rights were, and it got so bad that in the end, something just clicked, and I was in an incredibly dark place. I never want to sugarcoat how hard that is for victims to
mm,
navigate that system, even under the best of circumstances, let alone when you've got the trauma of domestic abuse. And I was a single mother of a very young child, baby. All the issues around that, no legal representation, no money. I was in a mess going, and I had judges treat me absolutely appallingly. And I think
oh,
it got so bad that then something clicked, and that feeling of desperation and being in complete darkness
mm,
turned to anger. And I was like, I've had enough. I've
yeah,
had enough. And it's not that some of those feelings have ever gone, because, like I said, I never want to sugarcoat that journey, that healing journey. You have good and bad days. When you've suffered that kind of trauma, it's
mm,
not a linear process. You can have bad days for a really long time. Um, but definitely there did come that point where I thought, enough now, enough. And
mm,
I reached out to my local MP at the time, who was amazing. Um,
great.
and supported me and gave me a bit of a voice. And that was a pivotal moment in my journey where I then began to take back some power. And then I learned that it wasn't just my case and it was happening, this was the norm that was happening in the family courts, that domestic abuse kills 2 to 3 women a week. It's still in the UK. And again, I thought, this is some things, it's really hard to say something's happened for a reason because I could really do without the trauma and everything. But at the same time,
Mm,
I was like, I've been put on this path for a reason as well.
yeah, that totally makes sense because, you know, like you say, in life we don't choose the difficult, uncomfortable, you know, traumatizing experiences. But like you say, to look back probably in your experiences, the whole thing of, well, helping other people because it's everywhere. And that's another thing for me. Like, I think for a long time I thought, oh, well, that's in my past, that's what used to happen. And then I would say in the last, I don't know, 15 years, I feel like every day it feels like it's got worse, not better, you know,
Yeah.
over that period of time. And I'm kind of trying to, and the idea that there are young, well, it doesn't matter any age, but young people coming up and thinking that's the norm. So having the conversations helps. But as I said, like people for yourself doing the work that you do is, you know, amazing. It's kind of, well, it's groundbreaking, isn't it? Because never before to challenge courts as well. That must have been such a daunting
Yeah.
thing for you to go through that and know in your heart this is wrong. You know, this is. Sorry, what did you say was the trigger point for you? What was the thing that made you feel like, right, enough is enough? What got you to the anger point?
There were so many things. The whole experience was so unfair. I remember one judge, when I said that I wanted to contest something, he kind of threw his hands in the air, like as if I was just some big inconvenience. And my ex-husband had drug issues, and he had caught hepatitis C from using drugs, so it was pretty bad. They didn't order any drug testing,
Oh,
um, and then he broke a non-molestation order. I temporarily stopped the contact because I felt that this was wrong. The whole thing was wrong, and I kept emailing the courts. It went on for months and months and months. I was emailing them, saying I want an appeal. I want some help. This shouldn't be happening. And then I found out that they'd put a bar on my case. And obviously, as I was a litigant in person, I didn't understand what that meant. But basically, what it meant is that only those judges, magistrates could see the case, nobody else could.
oh my
I
gosh.
was like, so basically, every email that I'm sending in complaining is just going straight to them, and
Oh,
they were going missing. Um, so I think it was just that whole thing, and I just thought, no, this is really
wow.
wrong. But unfortunately, this is the norm, and it's still like that today in the family courts. Um, and there's a lot of movement. In 2020, the domestic abuse bill happened. We were made promises. Unfortunately, some of those promises haven't been upheld. The Prime Minister now has said that there is going to be more reviews into the family court. So we're hoping that that's going to happen. But for people that are living it, and that's their life, and that's their children's lives, as it's going on today, it's a horrifying experience, and it's life changing.
I can imagine there's nothing, I mean, it feels quite sinister, you know, to think that you first of all, I think it does take a lot of guts to even write the email to a court and say you're doing things wrong because it's, you know, you feel like, well, this is the court, they're the highest power, that's how we feel. And so to pick up the courage and know that you're emailing and then finding out that they're just brushing it aside, like, and again, with every other industry, I think you've got ombudsmans, haven't you? So if you don't get the result that you want, let's say from, I don't know, a bank, a financial institution, and they're not doing what they should, that you can go then higher to a separate body for them to investigate. But there's nothing like that for the courts, is there? They
Not
are.
really. Even when you can complain, the complaints procedure is so long, your case is going to be over and an order is going to be made. So it's not in real time.
Mm, gosh, it really feels as if it's set up
Mm,
to be that way, to put you off, to
yeah.
silence you, basically. That's how it
Yeah.
sounds.
And that's there is a saying that abuse thrives in silence, and that's true of being in any type of abusive relationship, but also of the systems that then enable that. And I think that's
Mm,
one of the biggest things that always, that saying sort of stuck with me. Abuse
yeah,
thrives in silence. So one thing I always sort of stand by is that they won't have my silence.
yeah, I love that. I've just typed that up because I like that. Because not that I enjoy the fact that that's true, but it is so true, and it kind of speaks volumes. Um, yeah, that if you're silent, so many people will turn a blind eye. And then, actually, to be fair, even if you speak up, people turn a blind eye as well. So yeah, it's it's really sad to be at that position. And I like to, situations like this, like injustice. I always think, why is society like that? Why has this happened? How comes that's the way things are set up? And I suppose it can go back, way back in history, because men were, like, even women having to fight for their rights to vote and things like that. That tells you what kind of society we are developing from, where
Mm,
women are not seen, it's like a second-rate citizen, or
yeah.
not necessarily, almost like in the background. We're only needed for certain things, and then
Mm,
those needs are satisfied or no longer needed. It's like being rubbish. That's how it feels. Um,
mm,
and I always kind of think that, yeah, we have made big strides as a society, but there's still so much, because I think there's so many people who are still not speaking up,
mm,
or are afraid to speak up. It's not the easiest thing to do at all. Um, and also this idea of healing, and where do you start? How does that? I think, just by listening to your story, that part of your healing probably started with the anger. You know,
mm,
like they say about, with grief. I can't remember the 9 or 10 steps that you go through, but anger has got to be probably the one that makes us feel relief in the moment, even though it's not the answer.
mm.
But definitely feeling anger and feeling like you're doing something does
Yeah.
kind of give a start, if that like, if you like, to the healing. And
Mm.
were you practicing? I forgot to mention you're a Reiki practitioner.
Mm.
Were you practicing Reiki before? Had you had Reiki sessions before, or was it something that came along on this journey?
So I'd always been quite a spiritual person,
Mm,
and I was really lucky. I was brought up on a farm and close to the forest, so that being in nature was always really important to me throughout my
yeah.
life. It was always somewhere that I went to find some peace and clarity, and always enjoyed walking in the forest and being around animals, and that was always a big part of me. And from that came a lot of spirituality. But when I was
Mm,
really suffering bad anxiety and really in some of those traumatic phases, I actually found it quite difficult um, to meditate and that kind of thing, because your brain is in just so much chaos, and
yeah.
you can't kind of positive your way out of it. And sometimes that in that you kind of need that acceptance and safety,
Mm,
before you can make those steps. Reiki came quite a long time after I'd obviously had Reiki as a treatment a few times and found that it helped, because it just
yeah.
gave me a space to
Mhm.
just sort of be. Because when you're in a traumatic state, whether it's domestic abuse or whatever it may be, you are in a lot of chaos and there's a lot going on. Um, and finding a safe space is really important, and it can be really difficult. And for me, Reiki really helped with that. And then when I started to actually learn it and practice it, the first stage is self-healing, and that was a really profound moment for me. It was quite empowering because I then learned the ability to self-heal and give myself that space within, and that was really important. And I had some really profound moments with my Reiki master in that moment, in those times, and it did really have a huge effect. And again, I don't want to sit here and be like, oh, it's all sunshine and lollipops and it's all fine now, because that's not reality. When you've experienced trauma, and that's why as well I wanted to train in trauma, because if you've experienced that, you're not going to just be okay magically. No one has a magic wand and can erase that. And you grieve your former self,
Yeah.
and all of those things, and you have to find some acceptance in that journey. But Reiki definitely helped me, and I think it has the ability to hold a space, a safe space for people, so they can then start to heal. And as human beings, our whole bodies and brains are healing mechanisms. Our brains have the ability to rebuild pathways, but we just need to find a space in order to do it. And I think that's the beauty of Reiki, and anything somatic like yoga, all of those things that allow us a space and give us some empowerment that we're doing it ourselves as well.
Yeah, yeah. It's really interesting you said that, because it just gave me this thought that, in my experience, a lot of people, which I imagine must still be the same now, people judge, why aren't you leaving? You must. I remember somebody saying to me, who didn't really know me very well, you must really love a beating. At the time it broke me, it crushed me, because I thought, is that what people think? That I'm enjoying this, and it's like some kind of attention. But it is interesting because people did say, oh, well, why don't you leave? And so I used to think, well, why don't I? And it's fear, obviously. There could be lots of different reasons, but fear for me was one of them, and being threatened what would happen if I left. But as soon as you, like you say, take that power and realize something within yourself, I think that's, even if you're still in the situation, that is the first steps of healing. Because I feel like once I accepted that this isn't the way I want my life to be, is this my life now? You get to a point where you are looking for things that can help you to heal, like you say, whatever that might be. But it's definitely like a decision that you make within yourself, would you say? Like this thing that you say, enough is enough. Like you said, the anger, really thinking about it, looking ahead towards the future, and just wanting change, I suppose. Would you say that's like a big part of that switch that changed for you, or with people?
Yeah, I think as well, one of my biggest drives obviously was my daughter, and I didn't want her to grow up in that environment. And I also was like, how can I change the narrative on our story? Like, this has been a huge part of our life and it's been awful. So how do I change? How do I take back some of that power? How do I change the narrative and leave a legacy behind for me and my children that is then positive, that they have something to be proud of? And that was a really big push for me as well, I guess.
Yeah, yeah, I can totally imagine, because I suppose that's another thing as well. When you have a child, it's almost like you feel, well, it's the responsibility. So you feel like it is your responsibility, and it's that consideration of where you are at the time and where you want to be and where you feel like you should be, because
Mm.
nobody, deserves to be in this kind of situation. Did
Yeah.
you find that with Reiki, because I've practiced Reiki as well, so I know the self-healing journey. But did you find that people around you, like friends and family, uh, were understanding of that? Would you say was that your group, if you like, or were you already in that kind of environment where people accepted things like Reiki?
Yes and no. I think mostly I'm quite lucky that I have a new partner now, and he's always really supportive, and I've got some really supportive friends around me. Um, yeah, I think that it's important though to be true to yourself and not worry too much about what other people think. This was something that was really profound for me and
Mm.
really important to be able to give to others as well. And I'm sure that there are people that have whatever projections they want to do, but they haven't walked in my shoes, so I'm not
Yeah.
worried.
Yeah, no, that's good because that's the strength of it, I would say. Because then when I would say to people, "Oh, yeah, I've done this course on Reiki," and people are like, "What?" It's a bit, and it's the same with yoga, to be fair. And
Mm,
to me, yoga feels like something that has been in society for a long time, but sometimes people just have these ideas of
mm,
certain practices, and sometimes I do think maybe it's a fear of the silence. When you find silence, the first thing you are doing really is shutting down all the outside, um, I don't know, experiences, judgments, and you're dealing with just yourself. And that is a really hard thing to do because it's almost like letting go of everything that you know, and you look internally. So
mm.
some maybe, my experience has definitely been that people think it's all a bit woo woo and fairy stories and things.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's had a great impact for me, and that's the key. Like
Mm,
you said, it's what you know and what your experience is the most important. Really,
yeah.
yeah, that
And we
is.
can all get a bit of imposter syndrome. And again, it's important to question where that comes from, if that's
Mm,
actually our fears or somebody else's fears being projected. And but I do also think that now there is a huge movement, like wellness movement.
yeah,
And I think that's really indicative of the times that we're living in, that people clearly need it. And they
absolutely.
need Reiki and yoga and nature. People are looking for something
Mm,
to heal, and they're looking for safe spaces because there's a lot going on.
yeah,
For everybody out there in the world, there's a lot going on, and life demands a lot from us. And a lot
yeah,
of people are affected by burnout and things that are going on in the news, and
mm,
they need a healing space.
yeah, yeah. And I think it's important as well because I think a lot of people probably don't realise, and I didn't for a long time. The idea I remember years ago when you say, if someone was going to counselling, it was kind of seen as an American thing anyway. That's what the Americans do. And yeah, it just wasn't something that entered my mind. And the first time I went to counselling was due to bereavement.
Mm,
When I went, I thought, "Oh, why haven't I done this sooner?" Because it's so powerful. I mean, like you say, there's different things, Reiki,
mm,
yoga, meditation, your breathing exercises, but counselling, it's almost, I always describe it as each individual building a toolkit for themselves when they need, that support,
mm,
um, silence, their well-being. But yeah, to be able to say, actually, I'm not all right. This isn't all right.
mm.
Is such a strength because that's the only time you're actually going to step forwards and look for a way out, look for change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's counsel. I've had therapy and counselling, and my
Mm.
mum was actually a psychotherapist. So,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
so for me, it was quite normal, I guess, to go to
Mm.
therapy. It was much more normalised in our family, and but it is again, it's a safe space, isn't it, to speak, and you get validation, I think, from it as well, which is really important that you can
Mm.
speak about what's going on with no judgment and be validated within some of those things.
Yeah, yeah. Did you find that, when you were initially going through, we were saying earlier about, the red flags that we can recognise now, but at the time, we're kind of just getting on with life. Um, did you talk to anybody in the early days about things, or did people look and think, that doesn't look right, and try and have a word with you? I don't know if you.
I think sometimes people are fearful of saying what they think because they don't want to make the situation worse.
Mm,
And sometimes there were some people after that said, "Oh, Charlotte, we were worried and we saw things and we didn't like him and we didn't like some of his behaviour, but we didn't want to say because we didn't want to put you in that position."
mm,
I understand. But I do remember when I was pregnant, things got really bad, and I did say some things to a friend, and she said, "This isn't right," and I said, "No, I know, and I'm not sure how long I can live like that." Um, but obviously, I was in a terrible situation because I was pregnant by that point. I had no money. And my parents also at the same time had lost everything. They had some financial issues that got worse and they had to declare bankruptcy, so they had nothing. So I was in a
right,
really vulnerable position where
yeah,
I didn't have anywhere to go. So I was like, I have to really tread carefully here and try and make this work and think, what can I do here? But there were people that did recognise certain things. Yeah.
yeah. Because I think, even the way you described that as well. Not, I don't know if that's. I don't want to say that there's. I remember people having this idea, and I say this is just people around you, putting in their 2 pence worth of information, but saying things like, women who go through domestic abuse, it's usually somebody who's got daddy issues. I remember someone saying that to me because my parents were divorced, or certain people who are vulnerable in the first place, like almost like you've got so much to give that you just take on any person, this idea. And I actually thought that for a while. I actually believe that I must have some kind of something about my energy, me as a person, that's people can pick up is like a weakness. But
Mm,
I don't think that. I think there's all sorts of people, from all, and I think these are the problems. These are the things that will stop people speaking out. If you're somebody who's got I don't know, I'm trying to think of lots, a judge, then maybe a female judge who might find that difficult to talk about it because of her role, and she's supposed to be somebody who's strong, who wouldn't accept a situation like that. Or, does that make sense? Like this
yeah.
idea of a type of person
Yeah.
that's going through domestic abuse.
Well, it's almost like trying to create the perfect victim, but it doesn't
Mhm.
exist
No,
because
no,
anybody can suffer. And again, it's about how manipulative the perpetrator is and how covert some of their behaviour is for so long that it can affect just anybody. And I've
yeah,
come across victims that are, really high powered, running
mm,
companies in the business. I've come across police officers who have been domestic abuse victims. Um, and it's really important. Like, I was the same as you for a really long time. I thought, oh, there's certain traits that I have that I know I can be a bit of a rescuer and
yeah,
and like
yeah,
want to, help people. And I probably saw things in him that I felt sorry for him, so I turned a blind eye. I thought I could, you know, make it better if I was kind enough. But
yeah,
then at some point I was like, well, I am that person. I was raised to be that person. But
mm,
the onus is still on him for taking advantage of that trait.
okay,
That's
yeah,
not on me, because I want to be empathetic and kind. And that's where that kind of victim blaming comes in, and it's there throughout our society. And even victim blaming itself comes from fear. Like, there's been research by a doctor in America about the reason why is because if we can put the blame on the victim, then it's less likely to happen to us. Whereas if we actually say, no, the blame is on the perpetrator, that means that we're all equally as vulnerable.
yeah, it can happen to anybody.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. I never kind of thought of it like that. And I suppose people don't, it's the idea of, well, just walk away. And, sometimes you are a bit protective of the abuse. Because I remember keeping certain things to myself because I was worried about, well, if they hear that bit, that's really terrible. It's almost like you don't want to say the whole terrible situation because you are afraid of being judged and
Mm.
how that looks. But yeah, it's definitely something. So, would you say that right now, in your work and the work that you do you feel like there's progress being made? Obviously, not enough because there's still so much happening, but
Mm.
you feel like it's on the right track and it's things are moving in the right direction for improvement and
Yeah, I think definitely there's been a lot of movement in the last few years and people speaking out,
yeah,
and a lot of education around domestic abuse. Um, and that's a really positive thing. There's a long way to go with parts of the judiciary system. I do
mm,
think that the police are trying to make changes and understand. And there have been a few cases where I've come across where police officers have actually named things like coercive control and said, no, this isn't right.
right,
So that's positive. Equally,
mm,
though, there are some that are still useless. But
yeah,
I think there are some changes. It takes a long time to really shift a culture. So it
mm,
does take time. The family courts are still a major issue, I think, for victims navigating that. But
yeah,
in society, and particularly this is where EIDA's work is so important, um, getting that education into big organisations, there's a huge movement for that, and it's going to become vital for businesses to be involved in that education and society. And I do think there's so much more awareness now than there was even 5 years ago.
yeah, definitely, definitely. And that's what I was thinking. Is it the fact that it's getting worse, or is it just that we're hearing about it more? Because again, when I was in my teens and 20s, this definitely was not the topic of conversation. You just wouldn't, and it was often seen as if you're. I remember when I called the police and not my friends and my peer group found out, the majority of people, male and female, their response to that was, "Oh, it's her fault. Look at another woman getting a man into trouble." Do you know that that's how it was seen?
Mm.
And that was really hard. But my mum was the driving force in my getting me help. Um, but yeah, sometimes I look back and I feel like it was a whole different person, and I think that's key because like as you grow, don't you go through different phases of life, so you feel you can look back in a more, like I say, you can look back and see things clearly, and then I suppose it is about prevention. Would you say that's like important? Like if people have got the education, like in schools, from a young age, for potential perpetrators as well, because
Mm.
if young men and some young women have grown up in that kind of environment, that's all they know, and it's almost like I know I always felt like you mentioned earlier, like you feel a bit guilty sometimes, or you did feel guilty, and you don't want to feel like you're a problem. But if there are people who play on that, like if they're not loved in their own family,
Mm.
and then they want to control somebody, like somebody shows them love and attention, and all of a sudden it becomes like the focus, a bit of an obsession with this person who's shown them, this love and this care. But if there's education from probably a school age, maybe that helps people understand on both sides, the victims and somebody who has got the potential to be an abuser.
Mm.
Do you think, or do you think,
Yeah,
yeah,
I think there does need to be overall more accountability for perpetrators because we see a really low conviction rate around domestic abuse and violence against women and girls in general. So we do need to really concentrate on that. I do believe that, but also the more education we have, when we look at the statistics in domestic abuse, that there's
mm,
1 in 3 women that will be victims of domestic abuse. That also means that we will then know a lot of perpetrators within our society.
yeah,
Because it's not going to be just one or two perpetrators perpetrating all of that crime. So while there's that many victims, there's also that many perpetrators. So if we can start to understand red flags, and we can start to understand what domestic abuse is, and that it's really based around power and control, then we can call out behaviours that are not okay. And if we learn that from a young age, and that's where it's really important as well to get men involved, to get everybody involved, because men should be taking responsibility and calling out other men's behaviour rather than just making it okay and saying, oh, same for women as well, of course. Like, but in your group, in your peer group, if things are being said that are not okay and that are very misogynistic or abusive or controlling, then to be able to spot that and call it out and say, no, that's not okay. Because what we see quite a lot is that these behaviours for generations have gone on with nobody calling it out and actually enabling it. So then that causes a problem. So that's a major thing that we need to think about in our society.
Yeah, totally. Because it was all, and again, part of me thinks, only because of, again, my experiences. And actually, I was speaking to, it was about a year ago, speaking to some female friends at the time who were around me at the time, and we just had this conversation where they were going through similar situations, probably not as, I can't say it wasn't as bad, it was just different. Didn't go as far probably as mine did, but never spoke, because they saw what the chaos and the nightmare that I was going through, getting an injunction out, I think that's what they called it then, going to court, having my mum go through all that pain as well. And they were looking at me and thinking, I'm not not going down that path. So they were just kind of sitting in silence but watching, which, again, at the time, you don't realise some of your closest people might be going through a similar thing, but because of what they can see you're going through, will just not, speak up. And just the idea for like his friend group, I definitely think there was people who were afraid of him as well, but just kind of went along with it because there's this, idea of, we're the blokes, we're the men, and that's what he's doing, and we're not really going to say anything. I can see you getting attacked, but what can I do? So yeah, that was the thing for me. I thought, well, maybe if that's something that starts quite young, because I've been reading about this. It's for some, it's even in school. Girls in school having relationships with boys of their own age, but going through this kind of domestic abuse at such early age, and it's just,
unfortunately, when I do a lot of lived experience educational talks in colleges, and one of the things we do get a lot of disclosures after, unfortunately, and they're 17 years old and coming to tell their experiences, which is always really sad. And it's always difficult because on one hand you get that, which is awful, and you think, gosh, they're so young to be dealing with this. But then on the other hand, there's also a really good response sometimes as well to that lived experience, and you can tell that people are genuinely concerned and are touched by that story. So it is really important, that education, and from a young age, because we need to be mindful that this is happening at a young age, and those very embedded and ingrained ideas start to happen young. So if we can shift some of those perspectives from a younger age, then that's going to make a far greater impact later on, and hopefully, like you said about prevention.
Yeah, that would be, it's a huge task, I suppose, and it's a lot of different agencies and things that have to be involved. I suppose it starts with us, our individual awareness and things that we can kind of look out for or try to help with. And so, I just wanted to mention, I know you said you've written a children's book.
Yeah.
So was that something was it completely separate, or was it through your experiences that you felt?
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, it's called Daisy and the Sticky Escape, and it was a complete like passion project. I always loved writing and creative writing, and I always wanted to be like a children's book writer, but I guess especially when I was younger I never really had the courage to do it. Like, it's quite, you kind of put yourself out there, and I just didn't really have it. And then the story is actually based on a true story where I grew up on a farm. I had
Mm.
chickens, and one of the chickens nearly got eaten by a fox, and it's about that. So it's
Oh,
kind of like fun story. And I used to tell my daughter these stories all the time, and she said, "Oh, mummy, please, could you make it into a book?" So I said, "Okay, I'll try." And I didn't even tell anyone because I was like, it's never going to happen. And I sent it off to the publisher, and they came back and said they'd do it. So I was like, oh my God, it's one of those things. So one of
mm,
the biggest things I think to take from that is, if you do have an idea for something creative,
mm,
go and do it, because you never know. Don't allow
yeah,
that imposter syndrome to hold you back. Like, you
yeah.
never know what might happen.
Yeah, that's amazing. It really is, because what a beautiful thing to do as well. Because obviously going through, that traumatic times with your daughter, and I
Mm,
suppose it's always having that worry about, oh, is she going to be okay? But then doing something so beautiful, I love that. I'll also put a note or a link in the show notes so people can check that out. And do you
mm,
feel like storytelling is something that I always find writing quite healing as well? To kind of express yourself, even if no one's reading it, just being able
mm.
to zone out and be in a different world. Do you feel like that helps?
Yeah, I think I always journal, and it's something that I always encourage my clients to do. And when I host women's circles, we always do write intentions, and I talk about journaling and manifesting, because there is real power when we actually write something down.
Mhm.
And it's been proven as well now that that power is there. When we really write something, we put an intent to it. And
Yeah.
even journaling, it helps us to process as well. And we can then reflect back, look at our journey. And it's a really great way to heal, I've always found, because it does help you to process and get things out. And there's all sorts of things that I have always done with my daughter. We do like positivity jar, and we do like a gratitude jar, and a worry jar. So if something's worrying us, we write it down and put it in there.
Oh,
And it's a great way to process and to get our feelings out, and especially for children.
mm,
Um, it's really important for them to express themselves, and sometimes that's difficult if they're young.
mm.
But even for all of us, like I said, I always encourage people to do it when I'm doing my women's circles, and we always have like a part of it where we set intentions.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Just to ask as well, as you mentioned, was your obviously your daughter was really young when
Mm.
you were going through the difficult times. Is she aware now? Is that something that you have to try
She's
to
still very young, like she's still only 7.
explain?
We still are going in and out of courts and everything. Unfortunately, it's not completely over yet. So that's still a journey that we are on, unfortunately.
Mm, mhm, Is she aware of it? Like, is it something you feel like at that age 7 that you need to explain, or do you kind of, and this just must be nosy really, just to have that thing of, do you kind of keep it completely separate, or are there things, because obviously it being her dad and stuff, is there,
Mm.
I suppose the reason why I'm asking is because, I'm aware of somebody who isn't going through court but won't leave an abuser because of their children.
Mm.
And it's that whole idea of saying, well, I don't want them to have a bad impression of their dad, which, I understand. And I'm not in those shoes, so I can't.
Mm.
But what would you say about a situation like that? Like,
There is a book actually by a professor called Dr. Emma Katz. And she wrote a book a few years back about coercive control post-separation abuse where children are concerned. And she's done a lot of research in how children are affected by abusive behaviours, and even when it's post-separation, coercive control, and the impacts of that. Children
Yeah.
do feel it and see it. And even there is legislation under the 2020 Domestic Abuse Act that states that children are now victims in their own rights, even when they're not physically seeing it, because of the impact on victims, and particularly with mothers, when you think about a child is a direct extension of you. So
Yeah.
where there's economic abuse, financial abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, it will automatically affect that child. It always does. By financially abusing the mother, you are then directly financially abusing the child. So it's a very difficult thing to navigate when you have to parent with a perpetrator, because and that's what Dr. Emma Katz explains,
Wow.
that those things are incredibly difficult, almost impossible. She believes that most perpetrators don't have the ability to be good parents because they just don't have the capacity to, almost.
Yeah.
And they're so intent on control that will, they may love their child in some way, they may tick the right boxes, and you get lots of different forms of control. And they may do certain things in order to keep that control, but unfortunately the impacts on that safe parent and on the child, it can still be devastating, even when it is that coercive control post-separation.
I totally agree, because I always, and again, it's not really because I haven't walked in those shoes. As I said, I hate to judge because I don't know how that would feel. But when you hear somebody say, "Well, he's a really good dad," for me, he's not a good dad, because and everybody, like you say, everybody's versions of love can be quite different. Actually, what people say, "Well, I love this person," and their actions around that love. But I kind of, I don't think most people do, I don't know, but you understand love. So having a child, for instance, or just my husband, because I haven't got children, the idea that lots of people love him as well makes me feel good, because then I know that he's loved, the more people see the child. But if a father is abusing the mother and then doing what he says is good for the child, actually, by abusing the mother, he, like you say, is abusing the child, but is actually hurting the child, because that child's mother is not in a good space. So whether it's trying to destroy her or bring her down or physically abuse mentally and emotionally, that means it's a conscious thing, I think, to hurt the child, because you're taking away somebody who is going to love your child. You've got that in common. But yeah, it's just something I thought of when you said that, because it's a hard situation, and maybe there's different reasons why, like you're saying, if you're financially abused, like the person that I know, it's the idea of walking away with nothing, probably having to go to a women's hostel. What will people say? And being, judged by people. You've taken your children away from their dad. And like you're saying, it's so complicated. There must be so many different things that you've got to deal with, that the whole situation can look bleak, and you haven't even taken a step out. So
Yeah.
I
And
can
we still have that really entrenched view in our society that women stopping contact is like the worst thing that can happen. Yet we don't put the onus on the person who's abusing. And it's something that is very insidious, because that was said to me when I first left, and they knew that he'd been arrested and all of these things. And a lot of people went, "Oh, but don't stop him from seeing the baby." Now, I wouldn't have done, and I did everything that I could to keep that contact going, but it actually then become too dangerous for both me and her, and then
yeah,
to kill. So we really need to move away from that you know, if contact has stopped, then
Mm.
why is it being stopped? Because let's face it, that I know that we hear stories of, you know, difficult separations under different circumstances, but the truth is, most women don't walk away from a marriage or partnership with young children with nothing
Yeah,
for the fun of it, and they don't just stop support networks just for the fun of it, just to be spiteful. Not really. Like, there's usually a reason behind.
exactly. There's nothing, you know, like you say, there's nothing worse. It's like deciding to step out of your, you know, if it was a situation without abuse, it's like saying, well, I'm just going to get up one day and step out of my safety, my cocoon, because that's how what it's supposed to feel like. Your husband in your home with your family, and you know, and to have the courage to be able to step out of that is,
Yeah.
you know, amazing. And then to be told, or again, it's a hard thing. I think it's more about, like you're saying, the education and people thinking about what they're saying and what they're doing. Because
Mhm.
again, for an abuser, I can't really see how that could be a good parent, you know. But yeah, maybe that's fun. And you know, the whole thing in the courts as well, because I know that's a big thing where they say that, you know, the child should know both the parents, but if one
Mm,
of the parents is hurting them, you know, it's in a roundabout way, it's still a negative
yeah.
experience for them.
Yeah.
And so so with your like Reiki and writing, would you say all of these have been really positive steps for you in your wellness and being able to move forwards and, you know, look ahead? Would you say that's been a big?
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, Reiki has helped me on a personal level to heal and to self heal. Um, and, you know, I want to build those experiences for other people, um,
Mm,
to create safe spaces, um, and to help others heal through their traumas. It's really important part of my journey as well, to be able to give back.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
and it's definitely been a big part of my journey in healing and rebuilding as well, rebuilding a life that I can be proud of,
mm,
and like I said, where I can give back.
yeah,
um, and I think, yeah, Reiki is a beautiful way to offer a safe space for
yeah,
myself and for others as well. It's really important.
yeah, yeah, totally. I really, I can, I feel that so deeply because you say once you find something that really works for you or has helped you,
Mm.
it's like you just want to tell everybody and kind of spread
Yeah.
that goodness and that guess what? There is something that can help. You know, like you
Yeah.
say, it's not solving everything, but it's definitely a help, a good
Mm.
tool. And I'm going to ask you this question. I know it's so, I don't know. I'm thinking, so if you could share one piece of advice with someone currently experiencing domestic abuse, what would?
Mm.
And I'm asking that question knowing, my gosh, like, is there one piece of advice? It's such a, you know, a big area.
I think one of the things I would always say is that it's not your fault
Yeah.
that you haven't done this.
Mm,
It's somebody else's choice to do this to you. Um, it's very difficult to say, oh, you know, you're not alone, because it can be a really lonely place. Um, but trying to find the right support, I did get amazing support eventually through Women's Aid. And I remember the people in my journey that showed kindness. There was a lot
mm,
of victim blaming and a lot of things said that shouldn't have been said. But I also remember the people that showed empathy and kindness as well.
mm,
And it's important to hold on to those people and surround yourself with people that are compassionate and
yeah.
empathetic and show you some kindness.
Mm, mm. I think that is really important. That's a really good one to just sum it all up, kind of thing. Don't blame yourself because
Mm,
it's kind of the first thing that people do. It's like you look into yourself, or why is this happening? What have I done? And maybe there's a part of me that's annoying that person. Maybe I'm doing something wrong. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's really a good, solid piece of advice. And so, how can listeners support you or your work, connect with you? If it's, say, for instance, I don't know, somebody who is working in a particular company and thinks, oh, that would be some good training. That would be, you know, for our workplace, we've got nothing like that. No one does.
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn.
Mhm.
Also, I have an Instagram page called The Holistic Path.
Oh, okay.
That's for my Reiki and kind of choosing more holistic journey on healing, looking at yourself as a whole and trying to treat yourself as a whole and looking at everything that's needed for healing. And obviously, I'm on LinkedIn for a lot of my domestic abuse work.
Mhm.
And obviously, anyone that wanted to know more about IDA's work, then just go onto their website and you'll be able to find out more through that about them through that.
Fantastic. I'll pop all these in the show notes as well. And are there any other resources? Obviously, you've mentioned IDA and even for your
Mm.
Reiki practice. Is there any, when you mentioned Women's Aid, which I follow those as well, they've got some really good stuff that they put out on their social media. Sometimes, because obviously I'm not in that situation now, but I'll read it and I think, oh, that's really going to help. That's a really, positive thing to put out there. Are there any other places that you'd say, or that
Yeah,
people?
I think there are quite a few good organisations like Women's Aid. If you are suffering domestic abuse, you
Mhm.
can call them and you can get a support worker. There are loads of groups like the Recovery Toolkit, a Freedom Program. They're amazing programs to help you in that journey, and they are within a group usually, but it's really important to find people that have been in the same situation so that you can feel validated and not alone. And
Mm,
certainly some of those programs I've done myself and I've found them really helpful and had support workers that have been amazing through Women's Aid. So I think if you are suffering domestic abuse, you can reach out and call them. And even if you know somebody else that is, it's always worth calling them to get advice. But yeah, definitely, I always wish that I'd reached out to them a lot earlier on in my journey.
mm,
It was a lot further down the line that I did. So I just think that don't hesitate, because sometimes you do get that feeling of, oh, I don't want to go down that route. I don't want to be a burden, but try and get that support and that specific support from somewhere like Women's Aid. And there are others. There's Refuge and there's other. There's all different more specific for different religions, different
yeah,
cultural things as well. That's really important as well, because obviously everyone has different experiences and it's important that those experiences are understood fully. Um, but an organisation like Women's Aid or something similar can be really helpful on that journey.
yeah, yeah. No, totally. I don't even, when I look back, I mean, I'm sure Women's Aid has been around for a long time, but so this is a long time ago, but I don't remember being aware of anywhere that I could go or talk to. And again, I
Mm,
feel like for me, those are the positive steps that places like Women's Aid are out there, and we've got the social media, so people can, even if they're not ready
mm,
to take that step away, just having that awareness that there's somewhere that I can go, there's somewhere I can call. There are people who are out there doing things, because that must feel really soothing, I suppose, in a way, that if you're in a situation like that and you're thinking about leaving, seeing some of the like media must give you hope, you know,
yeah,
things are
yeah,
changing.
yeah.
Mm,
And it's important not to be alone. And I think um, it's one of the reasons why I do love hosting women's circles, and I think it's something that I'm going to do online so that I can reach more people, because when we come together in a group, and especially for women, we aren't designed to be pitted against each other. We're not designed for that. We're designed really to support each other, and it's the society that we live in, which is very capitalist and patriarchal, that pits women against each other and causes mistrust. But actually, when women come together in a group for healing, they find safety and bonding. And it's the same as when I came in with Women's Aid in those group sessions. It was like-minded women that all had common ground and were all in the same situation. And there's kind of really like a power in that, because then you're not alone, and there's a bonding within that that's really, really important.
Oh, that sounds amazing. That'd be really good online as well. I'd love to keep in contact, just to find out more and spread that word, because I think that's true. I mean, I was on I don't use on Instagram, sometimes it will pop up. I don't know if you've had that experience, and it'll tell you what's happening on threads. So it's almost like immediately put you in this group. I don't really understand it, but the other day, somebody, it was a woman in her 40s saying, you know, she hasn't really got any friends, she hasn't got a circle of people. And then I just clicked on the thread, read her message, and then there were hundreds, absolutely hundreds of women all over the world, all different experiences, saying that they didn't really have, like, their work, they've got family, but they haven't actually got friends, people, other women that they can talk to about things like domestic abuse and just. And I couldn't believe it. I was just scrolling down and I was thinking, all these women who are just on their own, and it's almost like one person said something and then they all came together, and I thought, gosh, that's really, really powerful. It's brave to say that and then to come together. So yeah, I think a women's circle online would be amazing. I would definitely be interested to see when you start that up and how that goes, because that sounds yeah, absolutely. So what would you say your next steps are? Is there a plan? Not necessarily like in your work, but just on your journey, would you say? I mean, obviously, I know you're saying you're still in court and things, which must be difficult.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, like with regards to parenting with him, it's always going to be something that's going to be difficult for a number of years yet. And I'm hoping that in the future that'll be resolved in some way. But regards to like working and everything with Reiki, I just plan to hopefully grow all of those things. And especially with the children's mindfulness and meditation sessions, I'm hoping just to keep doing that and putting those things together. And I think the main goal is always just about spreading some light where there is darkness. So anything that I can do to kind of be that beacon of light, I guess, when somebody else is in darkness, that's the goal, I guess, overall for my page, The Holistic Path. And hopefully I'll do some more writing as well.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, it sounds amazing, and I just love that. It's like the drive to, like you say, shed light and show people, there is a path. It doesn't have to all be negative and darkness and alone, which really, I know I would have loved that. It's just the realization that somebody's there to talk to. Doesn't mean it solves everything, but definitely feeling like you can relate. And just lastly, is there a mantra or an affirmation? I kind of feel like you said it actually with it's never your fault. But is there something that you've adopted that you'd like to share with your listeners? Something that probably your own words or your own encouragement that you kind of.
I think one of the biggest things as well for me is that there's so much that happens that's out of our control, and I had to accept really awful things and try and move on from it. But I think I am a strong believer in when we come across something that is life-changing, where there's an injustice of some kind, where there's wrongdoing, that we should try and use our voice or try and make a contribution into making the world a better place when we come up against those things. And we can all do that in some small way, whether it's speaking out or healing or taking a path where you're giving others a voice, just like you're doing now by doing the podcast. It's making a major contribution into offering a space for people to speak and have a voice. And that's so important, regardless of what the issue is. Speaking up and trying to leave the world a better place. When we come across something that is terrible, then it being able to make some small change is what's really needed in the world.
Yeah, no, totally. And that's literally the podcast that's how it feels like. Is there something I can do to help? And is there a way? And then I thought, well, I can't be the only person. And like you say, some days I think, I'll do it. It's usually when I haven't got a guest, and I put a podcast out there, and I'm thinking, oh, people are going to be so bored by me just talking. But you know what? Maybe there'll be one thing that I can say, or one thing that they can pick up from the podcast. Think, oh, I'll listen to the next one, and get some kind of hope, I suppose, direction, something that can help people. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. It has been amazing, and I'd really like to catch up in the future if that's okay, especially about the women's circles. So I'll put all those links for the different organisations and your book and your Instagram, so that people can come and find you on your LinkedIn. But thank you so much for your time. It's really been powerful. I appreciate what you're doing, as I'm sure many people do. And speak soon.
Thank you so much for having me, Cleo. Thank you. It's been lovely speaking to you.
And you too. Thank you.